Chapter 3.
Alan!
Mrs. Chorus shrieked.
What the fuck is this?
Alan's back stiffened. She'd found it. Of all the things she could have found, she'd found the snake.
What?
He called back.
Mom, did you say something?
The clickety-clack of her shoes down the hallway preceded her. She stood in his doorway, refusing to repeat herself, stabbing him with her eyes. In her hand was a wooden board with a flayed garter snake tacked to it, skin held down by pins, along with several shriveled organs with handwritten labels. He'd left it in Michael's old room to dry under the window. That had been a mistake.
Oh, that, he said, returning his eyes to the computer screen. It's a project for school.
She stared at him with a look that he'd gotten quite used to. A look so old that he doubted it had ever been meant for him in the first place.
What kind of project is this? What teacher? I'd like to have a word with him.
Alan leaned back in his chair, calculating his options.
It's not a school project,
he said finally. It's a personal project. A look of dread passed over her eyes. She said in a small voice,
What? Biology is interesting?
His mom lowered the board out of sight and crouched down in front of him.
Alan, she said carefully, are you okay?
That made him slightly angry. Yes, Mother.
Did you kill the snake?
I found it in the garden.
Did you kill the snake?
He frowned at her. No, it was dead when I found it. I've never killed anything. She clutched his hand.
You wouldn't, would you? What the hell do you mean?
She took a deep breath.
You know you can talk to me, Alan. About anything.
He had a hard time not laughing at that.
I know, Mom. You didn't know your father, she said. I knew him better than anyone. You know, I know you too.
He stared at her, unblinking. She looked away uncomfortably.
I have to go to work.
She stood and walked out of his room, kind enough to leave the snake on his desk. She always said things like that, when she wasn't being an empath, whatever that meant. He was sure that he was like his father, assuming the man wasn't the supervillain she made him out to be, but that shouldn't matter. Sometimes it felt like she wasn't talking to him, she was talking to the dead man she believed somehow possessed him. He didn't like that one bit. Not so much the projection, but the uncomfortable emotion of it all. Alan did not have the kind of emotional bandwidth necessary to process something so mushy. A few minutes later, his mother called to him from the living room saying that she was going to work. He shouted, "Love ya, have a good day," and she echoed the sentiment before shutting the door behind her. The wiki he'd been browsing since waking up was growing a little stale, so he decided to switch over to social media for a bit. He scrolled down through the endless stream of selfies and dried-up memes. Along the way was a picture of his brother and his soon-to-be sister-in-law dressed up at a fancy party. Alan couldn't fathom how Michael had managed to weasel his way out of this black hole of a town into the good life. At the same time, he had faith that someday, somehow, he would find himself free of this place too. He gave the picture a like and closed the window. Hardly a picosecond had passed when there came a tap on his own physical window. Why Jake always did that when the door was just as easily accessible, Alan supposed was just a matter of mild rebellion. That was Jake's middle name, after all. Figuratively, of course. In response to the knock, he slowly swiveled around in his chair with his fingers pressed together, the cliché of the villain who's been expecting the arrival of his intrepid nemesis. Jake sometimes smiled at that display. Today, he did not. He looked tired and scared as he pointed frantically toward the door. Alan cocked his head questioningly, but Jake stepped briskly out of frame. Alan got up and followed to the front room. He undid the latch to let Jake in. As soon as the door swung open, Jake strode through and shut it behind him. "You look like you've seen some shit," said Alan. Jake laughed like a crazy person and peeked through the curtains of the street. If a human's ears could flatten, that's what Jake's were doing right now. Like a cat up a tree or something. "What are you on, man?" Alan pressed. "Has anyone asked about me?" Alan stopped to think. "No, not lately. I mean, some people were wondering why you weren't at school yesterday, but other than that, no. I don't think so. Why?" "Just wondering." Jake took a meandering few steps toward the hallway, turned, then sat on the arm of the couch and stared. "You want to see something cool?" Alan asked, knowing full well that Jake wouldn't give a shit about his dead snake. Jake looked at him. He squinted. Then his lips began to spread and curl up around his cheeks like they were trying to escape the hilarity of it all. He laughed. "That's what I was about to ask you." They sat in Alan's room while Jake explained what had happened. He presented his bruised ribs and cut arm as proof. Alan listened patiently, becoming more and more fascinated with every word. "You said there were more stars over there?" he asked. "On the other side of the portal, I mean." "Yeah," said Jake. "I could see the Milky Way." "Were the stars in different places?" "Shit, I don't know. Why does that matter?" "'Cause if they were in different places, you probably weren't in a different time." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What about a different planet?" Alan shook his head. "A different planet would have killed you." "Right," said Jake. "Of course. How fucking dumb of me." "So?" Alan prodded. "What, the stars? I don't know, do I look like a stellar cartographer?" Alan laughed. "Not at all." Jake squinted. "Well, whatever the case," Alan continued, "my money is on it being some other plane of existence, like Avalon." "Like Arthur and the Round Table?" "That was Camelot. Avalon was the fairy world where King Arthur died." "That would explain the fairies." "Well, modern fairies and old world fairies aren't exactly the same thing. And I think the fairies in Arthurian legend were more like today's elves." "They were people with wings, Alf. I think that constitutes a fairy." "You said they were Vespian. Like bees, I mean. Why do you think they put sticky stuff on your arm?" Jake shrugged. "I'm pretty sure it was honey. Probably to help seal the wound shut or something." That was exciting. Alan knew that honey had antimicrobial properties, and apparently Jake didn't. That made him almost certain that Jake's claims were real. Alan didn't notice himself get off the bed and start pacing. "The creature you followed into the portal, what did it look like?" "It was gross. It was wearing a mask so I couldn't see his face, but I think it had wings." Alan stopped and swiveled on his heel to face Jake. "What did the wings look like?" "Like insect wings. But it was big. Yeah, bigger than me. Lots of things are bigger than you. Not as big as you." Alan semi-consciously sucked in his gut. "Did it have an exoskeleton?" "It had skin. Bad skin." "Like dermatologically bad?" "Sure." "Did it have antennae?" "I don't know, Alf. Probably. It was a bug person. They're all bug people. That's what I said." Alan sat back down on the bed, steadying himself. His phone buzzed and he whipped it out. "Who's that?" It was Kenneth asking about Jake. Alan typed out a response. "Just my mom." Jake seemed to believe that. "So you don't think I'm crazy?" "I wouldn't go that far." Jake did not laugh. "But I believe you." He slipped his phone back into his pocket. "Are you hungry?" "Don't you want to see?" "Yeah, but not on an empty stomach. Let's eat something first. I'll make some coffee, too. Then we can go later, when it's dark." Jake looked like he was going to say no. He almost looked like he was going to get up and run out of the room. To Alan's relief, he simply nodded. "I could use a coffee." The knock on the door made Jake sploop coffee on his shirt. Alan got up to answer it. Kenneth walked in and poured himself a cup. He stared at Jake for an uncomfortably long moment before saying, "Thanks for ditching me." Jake didn't look at his face, apparently too preoccupied with studying the angular momentum of the black fluid swirling in his mug. "Sorry," he said finally. Kenneth then turned to Alan. "There's been a murder." "What?" Kenneth nodded solemnly. "Mr. and Mrs. Butts." "Who's that?" "You remember that kid from geography, Martin?" Alan nodded. "The one who's going to name his son Harry." "Right. They were his grandparents." Alan looked at Jake. "Did you kill him, Jake?" It was an obvious jibe, one of Alan's classic bad ones, but Jake still shot him a reproachful look. "Yeah, Alf, I fucking killed somebody." Alan looked down at his own cup. "They were hacked to pieces," said Kenneth. "Left only bones." "Maybe it was Ed Kemper over here," said Jake, motioning to Alan. "Hey, fuck you. Just a joke." Alan scratched his chin. "You think it was that thing? The creature that attacked you?" "Obviously." "We should tell the cops," Alan suggested. Jake guffawed. "Okay, sure. Hey, Officer Dixon, I know this'll sound crazy, but I was smoking some dope in the park last night and I saw a fucking gremlin. There were fairies too. Or something. They were Vespian. They covered me in honey. You might want to check with the people at CERN and see if maybe they accidentally ripped open a gateway to another world. I swear the DXM had already worn off by then." He laughed again. This silence felt like sandpaper. Alan shifted against the counter and looked at Kenneth. "Jake wants to go back." Kenneth shrugged. "Third time's the charm." Jake looked at him. You believe me? Kenneth's eyes looked suddenly very old. He nodded slowly. We saw you vanish into thin air. Jake perked up. So it's a deal then, yeah? Kenneth shrugged again. Let's get to it. Hold up, said Alan. The police will probably be looking for you. We gotta go when it's dark enough that we won't be seen, but light enough that we won't draw attention to ourselves with flashlights. You guys start gathering food, tools, camping gear, all that stuff. Meantime, I'll do some research. For the record, said Kenneth, I hate this. The others went to Kenneth's house while Alan sifted through Wikipedia pages on wormholes, insect intelligence, and anything else that might be useful. He found a short PDF guide on surviving the wilderness, which he printed out. Everything else he scribbled into a pocket-sized notebook. He filled his pockets with standard junk, keys, cell phone, etc., and headed out. When he arrived at the Braun Fields, Kenneth and Jake were packing a backpack with rations and camping equipment. Once everything was ready to go, they finished the cold pizza in Kenneth's fridge and departed. They took the back way into the forest through the trails near the subdivision. The temperature was fair and the walk was pleasant enough. They made their way to the place Jake indicated without any trouble at all. Nobody was around. Jake led them down the slope into the grove and showed them the spot where he claimed the portal existed. Doesn't look like much of a wormhole, said Alan. Why does it have to be a wormhole? Asked Kenneth. What else would it be? It's a magic portal, Jake insisted, as if that meant anything at all. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as bug people either. Guys, Kenneth interjected. They both looked at him. You done? Right, said Jake. Check this out. He walked up to the spot, slipped the backpack off his shoulder, and dropped it on the ground. He closed his eyes and spread his arms out dramatically. All right, what? Alan began. Jake disappeared. Oh, shit. Kenneth's eyes were wide, but he said nothing. A few seconds later, Jake reappeared. The coast is clear. He reslung the pack over his shoulder, stepped aside, and indicated for either of them to stand on the spot. Kenneth stepped forward. He stood there for a while, looking like he felt like an idiot, even closing his eyes and holding his arms out as Jake had done. You don't have to do that, Jake admitted. Kenneth's arms dropped to his side. What do I do then? Jake screwed up his face in deep thought. I'm not really sure how to describe it. It's like you have to know that it's there. I just saw you disappear. Maybe I have to drag you through like the creature did with me. Try leaning, said Alan. Kenneth cocked an eyebrow and leaned Jackson style to one side. Like this? No, I mean like, don't lean in any direction in the XYZ coordinates. It's some kind of transdimensional gateway, right? Lean W. Oh, of course. Why didn't I think of that? Just don't lean left, right, forward, backward, or anywhere in between. Kenneth looked like his head might lay an egg. Finally, he shrugged and closed his eyes. Lean W. After a few moments, he popped out of existence. Jake whooped and clapped his hands, then cringed as the noise hit him. Nice, he said low. Your turn. Alan stepped up to the spot and stood, wishing he'd actually know what he was talking about. Should he lean positive W or negative W? What was the difference? Maybe it was like inwards, or just skewed from backwards, like it looked on a 2D projection. While he was thinking, there came a loud crack whoosh from all directions. He was thrown sprawling to the ground as Kenneth returned through the gateway. Jesus! He cried, staggering back to his feet. Sorry, said Kenneth. He suddenly lurched forward and stumbled toward a nearby bush, vomiting. Oh yeah, said Jake. Should have warned you about that. Kenneth finished retching and Jake tossed him a water bottle. That was fucking loud. We'd better hurry. Kenneth wiped his lips and nodded. All right. He stepped back towards the portal. Nuh-uh, said Alan. One hit from a weaponized transdimensional portal is enough for me, thanks. He took Kenneth's spot and stood, waiting. He didn't think as hard this time, just recited the alphabet backwards, Z, Y, X, W, and closed his eyes. When he opened them back up, he was in another place. He'd expected some kind of kaleidoscope. Some technicolor tunnel full of melting clocks or something, but it was just like walking through a doorway. He quickly hopped out of the other's path, finding meager shelter behind a small boulder. The other two followed shortly. First Kenneth, then Jake after a few more seconds. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words were replaced by a torrent of bile. He turned his head at the last microsecond, missing Kenneth's shoes by an inch. It was pretty awful. It didn't feel good afterwards, like normal nausea. It was like his stomach had just had a mild tantrum and was still unhappy about something. He took the water bottle Jake handed him and washed the taste of half-digested pizza from his mouth. "So," said Kenneth, once all their stomachs had settled, "what next?" "We go forward," said Jake. Kenneth gave Alan a look. Alan didn't know what that look was meant to convey, but he nodded seriously. "We should be careful." "Maybe we should go back," said Kenneth. "We know this place is real. We believe you."
"Are you serious?" cried Jake. "What exactly do you want to go back to?"
Kenneth seemed unable to answer the question. Alan spoke up.
"This place has civilization, right? The monster and the little people. You said they wore clothes?"
"Right," said Jake.
"Clothing necessitates infrastructure of some kind. There must be civilization nearby. I say we find it."
"Civilization doesn't mean friendly," Kenneth warned. Alan turned to Jake.
"How many of those bee people did you see?"
"I don't know, 20?
"So, statistically speaking, when it comes to monsters trying to kill you compared to friendly beings, that's a 20-to-1 ratio. Sounds like pretty good odds to me."
"I don't think that," Kenneth began.
"You want to go back?" said Jake. "You know where the door is. Nobody's holding you prisoner. Now I'm going to find out what's going on here."
He began walking toward a path leading out of the clearing. "Jake," said Kenneth. Jake didn't stop. Kenneth gave Alan a pleading look. Alan shrugged. Kenneth looked conflicted, then finally extended his arm apathetically as if to say, "After you." They proceeded out of the clearing and into a thicker part of the forest. Every sound seemed to make Jake flinch. It was perplexing how he could be so driven to explore this place from which he had so recently come out so battered and beaten, but Alan wasn't about to press the matter. They proceeded deeper into the forest as the sun began to set.